Okay. Mm. Good morning, everybody. Um, Welcome back if you've been to these webinars before, and welcome if this is your first. Sort of quick comments about these webinars, folks. This is very much meant to be a safe space, place to learn, ask questions, share thoughts. Pretty much anything goes in here within the boundaries of respect and kindness. That's about all that's our big bumper. So, let it rip. Michael, I'll introduce Michael here in a second. He and I are going to go through some slides. We'll do a little level setting on this big subject matter. And then we will open it up for comments and questions. And that's the fun part, folks. So as you're listening to us, and really anything goes, like I said before. So don't hold back. No pressure to say anything, but don't hold back. Um, and I want to say, and we'll cut over to Sonia in a second, but so today we have a guest, Michael Kearney. Dr. Michael Kearney it is a big day for me. He is a dear friend and colleague and truly a mentor in some weird twist of fate. So Michael is the first palliative care doctor in Ireland, his native country. Was trained by Dame Cicely Saunders herself and has written several books, all of which have been helpful to me. And some weird fluke, I ended up in residency with Michael in Santa Barbara when Michael was coming to this country to work. And so my dumb luck to be weirdly a peer with someone who's a huge teacher for me. And I cannot say enough about Michael and his work and what he's done for me and to foment my own interest here. So this is a very important day for me. And Michael, thank you so much for being here and agreeing to do this. You beautiful man. Thank you.
Thank you, BJ. Thank you.
Yeah.
Great to be here.
So, all right, folks. Well, before we jump in, let's cut over to you, Sonia. Little
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here. As BJ mentioned, he and Michael are going to cover some topics on compassion and empathy and burnout. And after that, we get to your questions. And you can do that in two different ways. You can click the raise hand button and we will unmute you and you can speak with BJ and Michael. Or if you prefer to not do that, you can type your question into the Q&A and I will read it aloud for you. The chat is also open. So if anything comes up for you while they're speaking, please feel free to put it in there so we can all kind of get a hit of what you're thinking and feeling. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you, Sons. Okay. Let's jump in. So, Michael, I'll sort of kick us off here, folks, just to start with some basics. Compassion and empathy, words that are thrown around a lot. I think most people would identify them as virtuous words. They connote good things, pro-social things. They're a little bit different and they're deeply related. So compassion, as I understand it, and Michael, please, as ever, teach me along the way here and correct me as I go. But compassion, literally suffering with, it's a way to be with another. It is a way to love another. It can be a response to empathy. So empathy, again, these two words are used oftentimes interchangeably, but they're a little bit different. So empathy simply is the ability that we have as human beings, provided you have the circuitry for it. I think the exceptions would be folks who are sociopaths and not born with the the gear to feel the feelings of another. But otherwise, this is a deeply human sort of trait that we have. You could reduce it to our sort of anatomy, that we have these mirror neurons and that we get to feel things that others are experiencing. But it seems to be that's just a mechanism. There's something deeply powerful about this felt connection among humans, that I can actually feel what you are going through and vice versa. So empathy by itself is not necessarily a positive or negative. You can empathically feel all sorts of hard things that are going on for another person, or all sorts of beautiful, easier things, good things, quote unquote. But compassion you might say, is a response to that felt sense, and that you respond with this sort of loving, kind embrace, this accompanying someone, being with someone in a certain way, compassionately. Michael, does that sort of sum it up for you, or any other notes to throw in there?
No, I love how you described
Okay,
passion and empathy, BJ.
great. All right. Well, with that, folks, these are words that we'll be throwing them around the rest of the talk here today, but that's a little level setting for us. So let's keep moving. There's so much to get to. So, Michael, can you help us? There are distinctions to be made. I think a lot of us throw around the word burnout, like I'm just burned out, and that's sort of an end result. But there are details and there are differentiations in here. There are different kind of means to this end. So maybe you could help us understand these distinctions here.
Yeah, thanks, BJ. I'm happy to. So yeah, these are the three sort of commonly recognized, sometimes described as occupational stress syndromes, but really they're life stress syndromes. They're if we have too much of in a particular area, it can be overwhelming. And ultimately, the endpoint of all the different stress syndromes is burnout. But let's get to that. Kind of coming in from BJ's reflections on compassion as a way of acting on our empathic connection with another, to try and relieve their suffering, to try and make them happy. A compassion fatigue sounds like if one has done too much of that for too long and is depleted. And in some ways, that's one way of understanding compassion fatigue. But what I've learned about compassion fatigue over time is that it's also understood, and I think it makes a lot of sense to see it as what can happen if we are empathically close to someone who is in great suffering, especially if that's going to go on over time, and we're sort of undefended, and that over time we can get vicariously traumatized. So compassion fatigue is sometimes known as vicarious traumatization, or even secondary traumatization. So the early symptoms of compassion fatigue are very similar to the symptoms of PTSD, or kind of post-traumatic stress disorder. If that is chronic, if that is ongoing, if we're ongoing exposed to someone else's trauma, suffering, with little protection, it can lead to burnout. Moral distress is first recognized and described in the nursing literature, but this is where we find ourselves in a situation where we really have a strong inner sense of what the right thing that needs to happen is, but we're unable to act on that because of the environmental constraints, because of the situation we find ourselves in. So, the nursing literature that was described as kind of the nurse who's having to do painful procedures to someone, perhaps who's really, reached a point where their body just isn't able to come through this, and yet for reasons beyond that nurse's control, they have to continue to prod and poke them and do what they can see is causing them pain and maybe even suffering. And so they feel moral distress in a situation like that. But if you just think of, here we are in a world where so much is unfolding that, in our environment, in our politics, and we just look at our world on fire, and yet we see something that feels so wrong, and yet we feel powerless to perhaps make a significant difference, at least in the short term. That also gives rise to great moral distress. And moral distress in the short term can give rise to a sense of kind of loss of self-esteem and feeling impotent and unseen and unheard, but over time also leads to burnout. And so if we could go to the next slide, BJ, because everything leads to burnout. And burnout is, I mean, the burnout is something that isn't just the end point of compassion, fatigue, and moral distress. It's also a phenomena in its own right, and that kind of most directly happens from our interaction with kind of mindless bureaucracy. So fighting with insurance companies, being just kind of that kind of entanglement in that mismatch between what matters to us and what seems right and the administration, the bureaucracy. So the symptoms of burnout, the classical symptoms, are described as this sense of overwhelming exhaustion, physical and emotional, the kind of exhaustion that you don't recover from that easily. Depersonalization, a sense of disconnection, even dissociation. And lack of personal accomplishment means that you never quite achieve the sort of quality of in your work or in your life. You always seem to be kind of falling slightly short of how you'd like things to be or turn out. So those are the kind of classic symptoms of burnout. BJ, please come in, with your thoughts.
Well, yeah, thank you, Michael. And a couple thoughts. One is, we're talking oftentimes at Mettle, mental health within the context of illness, or healthcare or medicine, or, caring for folks who are sick or being sick ourselves, whatever. But to be clear, these are not just phenomena of the healthcare system or of medical work or of caregiving per se. Right? I mean, these are any human being in the world today might have access to any of these things. You don't have to work in healthcare or whatever. To be clear, this is a phenomenon. These are phenomena of being a human being in a complex world.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and so another point here too, or a question really. Sometimes I'll hear people distinguish burnout as, sometimes it feels like the problem's in me. I'm exhausted. I need to go tend to myself. That it's inborn to me, the person who is burning out. But I want to just draw a little attention to to much of this happens. It's not our fault. It's not some shortcoming. It's not like you're failing, even though it may certainly feel like that. Very often, I think with the word burnout, I've learned to turn my attention from the person who's burning out in terms of a root cause or trying to figure out what to do, to the system in which that person is living or working. And very often burnout reflects the problem of the system, not some inborn flaw or shortcoming or problem in you or me. Is that your sense too, Michael? And is that a fair distinction?
Absolutely. That's a good way of putting it. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Good. I mean, I think that's important. We'll get to this too at some point, folks. But in other words, the locus of work, of effort to somehow combat or push back on burnout, yes, there are things each of us can do to find our resilience. But very often the cue here is our systems need change. Our systems need work. That is the locus of the problem. And that's a very important thing, because depersonalization, the moral distress, the cascade that happens in these syndromes will make you feel like shit, excuse my French, and then you're tempted to think that there's something wrong with you. And that participates in the spiral down. And that is a false narrative that it's your fault somehow. So I really want to kind of put a pin on that one.
Thank you. That's
yeah.
good.
Okay. Shall we move on?
Yes, please. Let's do.
Roland? Oh, actually, one more thing I want to say is something that came up in popular press. I read an article not too long ago in the New York Times by Adam Grant, naming something empathic distress is related to compassion fatigue. And I'm not sure there's a huge distinction to be made that hasn't already been made here. But I guess it's back to calling out how prevalent these issues are these days, through social media, the internet, or whatever it is. what we used to concern ourselves perhaps with our immediate surroundings, our family, our friends, our community, at most, perhaps in a daily way. But now we're in touch with the world in a new way that our nervous systems may not have been designed for. So even if you're just humming along and everything's cruising fine in your life, just by virtue of being an empathic human being, being aware of what's happening in the Middle East or being aware of what's happening in Sudan or wherever else, we can, we open our computers and we're bombarded with a lot of pain in the world. So at that, and because we get to feel, we have to feel in some ways for others. Being in touch with millions of people means we might be taking on a burden, a load that is just overwhelming, period. Just the volume of things, the volume of misery that we can be in touch with beyond our own is profound, immense, and I think novel in our day and age. I don't know if there's much more to discuss there, but I just continue to call out the nature of this thing.
Thanks, BJ. That's great.
Yeah. So yeah, this is a good. Let's check ourselves, and Michael, over to you. But again, this is common stuff. So
So
what do you
really,
think?
I think what we wanted to do here was just kind of ask you just to kind of reflect.
Yeah.
It's a little bit of a burnout inventory. If you kind of look at these questions, could this be you? After a weekend of rest and relaxation, after a good vacation, do you still come back feeling, depleted, physically, emotionally? Um, as you kind of go through your day, do you have a sense of feeling slightly numbed, slightly disconnected, just kind of one step back and disengaged in your work, in your life? And when kind of really, set yourself to doing something that you really are hoping will go well, do you kind of do you notice that you're falling short in your efforts?
Mm.
Um, and that you don't care about this as much as you might have in the past. I think that's an important little addendum to the question. So really just putting that out for you to kind of reflect on, where you are in all of this, and if you recognize yourself in this.
Yeah, and this is a nice little sort of self-test, isn't it? Maybe it's worth sharing with the audience. I mean, as Michael and I talk, especially hearing Michael, there's expertise around this subject matter, but I don't mind saying that I certainly have danced with all of these syndromes,
Mm.
and in some ways continue to. This is not so. I don't know who's immune to this stuff. I certainly have not been.
Yeah.
And it's worth, I just wanted, there's solidarity around this subject matter for many of us, even though one of the outcomes is you might feel so alone. The truth is, on these notes, you certainly are not. This is common, and I certainly have danced with this. I mean, this is, the problems in healthcare these days of turnover and et cetera. I mean, it makes perfect sense, and you can see why. So I just want to make the point here, folks, that we, as Michael and I are talking, are not separate from these syndromes. We are certainly not above them. No way. I mean, this is
No,
yeah.
yeah. And yeah, I totally just echo that, BJ. And my kind of interest in this really came by at a time when I was, working on an article on burnout and kind of strategies to prevent burnout and help us get through if we are. And it was kind of aimed at physicians. And as I was finishing up the article, a light went on and I realized check. I was all of the above. And yeah, for me, it wasn't so much kind of the fighting with mindless bureaucracy or that kind of roadway or kind of road burnout. For me, it was more recognizing, having at that stage been in palliative care for working at the bedside for almost 30 years, I realized that a lot of kind of the grief, the pain, the suffering that was part of my day-to-day work had sort of gone in under the radar and taken a toll. And in my case, it was recognized as sort of chronic low-grade vicarious trauma was what kind of had really, really depleted me. So yeah, just echoing your point that I think my understanding and interest and trying to find good ways of not just recognizing what's happening, but of responding in creative ways have kind of come from my own personal experience.
Right on. Well, let's get to some of that work of how to respond. And I've learned so much from you on this. And by the way, folks, Michael's writing is so gorgeous on this subject matter and beyond. And we will, a reminder, there will be references at the end here. We'll point you to Michael's work and others too. So, all right. Self-care 1.0, which is kind of, first of all, I'll just kind of lead us, just jumpstart us here on this one. I remember hearing the phrase self-care, and it's almost funny, like it's interesting that we even have to say that, even name self-care, but it's true. We do. So much of the caregiving tradition in modern, Western world, at least, very easily tips into sort of a pathological altruism, is a phrase I've heard before, where the caring is a selfless act, and so you have to add back in the self at some point through a spa day or whatever else. The phrase self-care itself is already a tell that we've had a problem by removing ourselves from the picture of care. So that's just a quick lead in. What else would you like to say here, Michael?
Yeah, just to add that as we're saying here, it's self-care 101 is, I think, really describing what we do very instinctively to protect ourselves, just to kind of get through the stresses of being a sentient and sensitive human being in a world where there is a lot of pain and stress. And if we could go to the next slide, BJ, that really what self-care 101 is about is, in the stressful situation, realizing that we need to protect ourselves, we need sources of support. So, in a caregiving situation, or, that may be just realizing that you just need to take a break. You need to, and those of you on the call who are kind of, professional caregivers, that you take your coffee breaks, that you take your lunch break, that you leave work on time, that you maybe have a ritual on leaving work where you change your clothes, so you kind of leave one world behind as you enter your other world. So that's one part of it, the protection and support in the stressful situation, and having kind of good personal and professional boundaries. But the other part of it is having a program of activities and practices, and just recognizing where you get nourished, where you really find deep rest, where you really kind of restore your batteries, where you regenerate, whatever that is, with your family, with your loved ones, in nature, in your yoga class, swimming, whatever rests and restores you. So that's self-care 101, whether we call it that or not. We all do that just to get by, just as we sleep and eat and drink water.
Yeah. But that doesn't, by itself, that's wonderful. It's a step, but there's more to do. There's more to be, thankfully, because, a time away from work by itself does not necessarily cut it. So maybe we'll keep moving here. So how do we, how do we get beyond just the idea of some decent boundaries? What more is there for us to do, Michael, here, not only to stave off the pain that comes with burnout and various related syndromes like we're talking, but even, your work is, really points us to a way to thrive in the midst of these forces that might otherwise take us down. So it's not just a matter of getting by or something, but there is potential to actually thrive in these settings within the frame of this work. So how do we get there?
Well, I think that just the words you used, yeah, that I think self-care 101 helps us. It's a kind of basic survival skill.
Yeah.
But I mentioned I realized I was burnt out as I was working on an article on
On burnout.
promoting self-care 1.0, and I was doing everything that we were promoting. I wrote it with a group of others, and I was practicing everything that we were preaching in the article. I was doing it all, and yet here I was burnt out. So I realized I needed something more, and that's over time that became a search, a journey. What is that something more? Um, and for me, I've sort of come to recognize it as what I call deep resilience. And BJ and I have talked about this as self-care 2.0. Um, and so that self-care 2.0, what is it? It's all of the above. It's self-care 1.0, but it's a wider and deeper circle of recognizing what we really need to come through um, burnout, difficult times that are ongoing. And what I'd like to do, if I could, BJ, is just tell that little story I have. If we could go on to the next slide, unless you want to come in here first before I start.
No, no, I would love to keep going here. Yes, please continue.
Thank you. Okay, so this little story, I think, describes for me what deep resilience is better than any sort of conceptual frameworks that I could try to share. Um, this is the redwood forest up at Big Sur that I have been lucky enough over the years to spend time in from time to time, and during COVID, actually, it was one of the places, even during lockdown, that I could go and spend time in a little cabin that a friend loaned us up there, and just wander through these these gentle giants, and just being in their presence was kind of so restorative and wonderful. So this this image is from, I think, August 2020. When I went back in December 2020, a wildfire had swept through Big Sur and swept through this forest. And if we could go to the next slide. And so this is what it looked like. And I kind of wandered through just looking at this scene of devastation and burnout. But utter devastation, broken branches, broken trees, just ashes everywhere. And as I kind of wandered through, I came across, and we could come to the next slide. I came across this redwood, and this giant redwood had broken kind of midway up its trunk, and its body lying across at the bottom of the image there you can see on the ground. So I mean, here it was, charcoaled, blackened. I mean, I really took it for dead, and wandered on. And so I didn't have a chance to come back to Big Sur. It was in the summer of 2021, so it was sort of almost 18 months later that I next got back there. And when I did, I wandered back into the forest, and I, in curiosity, wanted to kind of just visit this broken redwood that I had met. And this is what I found. If we could go to the next slide. So it had not only survived, as you say, BJ, but it was thriving. And so it was thriving because of its deep resilience. It was thriving because, it didn't have a trunk, it didn't have branches, it didn't have leaves. That's not where its nourishment and kind of restoration had come from. It just didn't have that option. It had survived because of its roots, because of it being rooted in something deeper than what was burned. And one of the curious things I kind of learned about redwoods along the way is that they actually don't have a very deep root system. They don't have a tap root. So it's not that they have a deep rootedness. They have this incredible lateral root system. Their roots kind of spread out laterally, for huge distances and entangle with the roots of their neighbors, of other redwoods and other trees. So it's the rootedness of the redwood, and then kind of deeper still is as we're learning more and more about this incredible mycorrhizal network, that the wood wide web, as it's referred to, that it was tapped into. That's where it got its nourishment, its restoration. It came from that deep rootedness in literally the web of life. So it was that deep inner rootedness that had not only allowed it to survive, but to really become a forest itself, absolutely flourish in this way. And so that for me is deep resilience. And so deep resilience and self-care 2.0 for me means about recognizing, asking myself, well, what brings me into that sense of deep inner rootedness, and that deep inner rootedness in something more than my surface self, in something more than my skin encapsulated ego, as Alan Watts called it, because it's really the ego that gets burnt out. It's really the ego that's suffering from compassion fatigue, that's suffering from moral distress, or a mismatch between the ego and the environmental factors. But it's not the deeper ground of who we are, and where our deeper ground meets the deeper ground, as in the kind of mycorrhizal network, the web of life. What brings you into that deeper rootedness? Is it some kind of meditation practice? Is it forest bathing? Is it lying on the earth? Is it doing some kind of work in your body, or on a kayak, or, so really asking the question, what brings me to some place that I can recognize I'm in a place that's almost hard. It's hard to put it into words, but I know when I'm there that it somehow feels like I've arrived home into and learning how to access that, and learning how to rest in that and root in that. That's what deep resilience is. And we still need self-care 1.0 with all its strategies of protection and restoration, but we need this something deeper too, I think.
Yeah. And Michael, I know from your writing and just knowing you, Nests in the Stream, that book, and you have a long meditation practice. I think it's fair to say. And you also have explored indigenous cultures and other ways of seeing ourselves in the world. Is there anything, I mean, we could talk for hours. I could listen to you for hours, I should say. But is there anything to share a little bit more about your own personal journey of how, besides what you've seen here, is there anything else to describe along your journey, the interplay between meditation, what you've learned in the West, and what you've learned from other cultures? Is there anything to bring up here?
Well, thanks, BJ. I mean, there's so much, but and I mean, I tried to bring in a way the question you've just asked, in a way my latest book that you're familiar with, BJ, I know, and thank you, is Becoming Forest, and it's actually a fiction, but it's a story about a young girl who sets out on a quest, in a way, a quest to find out what deep resilience means and how to come into that. And what she finds in response to that question is really an answer to the question you've asked, because what comes together for her on her journey, she's coming from a very Celtic, nature-based past. Her uncle had a native teacher, so she's been sort of initiated into indigenous ways of connecting, not just with nature, but with the earth, with the living earth. So she really brings that with her, and different simple practices that allow that connection, that deep connection with the earth. And along the way on her journey to try and find out what deep security means and deep resilience means, she encounters a young Buddhist monk. And the young Buddhist monk has been introduced to some of the most profound teachings of Tibetan Buddhism, the Mahamudra and Dzogchen teachings, which really bring one uh, into the basic ground of awake awareness. And these are considered some of the most sacred, and they are incredible teachings. But they've only just very recently been made accessible to us in the West. I mean, Westerners have gone and received these teachings along the way, and brought them back in different ways. But it's just kind of relatively recently that they're coming back this way. And so anyway, just back to this young monk, her name is Aisling, his name is Dorje. And Dorje has left his monastery because he is aware that our world is on fire. And he's aware of how valuable these practices are. And he wants to find simple ways of making these practices available to to everyone, not just somebody who can go into a monastery for a lifetime or several lifetimes, but really just making them. And so he and Aisling kind of join forces, and it's that combination of earth-based connection and deep non-dual awareness practices, and finding very simple ways of accessing those doorways into the wholeness that's already there, that we all have within us.
And in a way, like your metaphor, literal, not just metaphor with the root system, it sounds like doorways into tapping to things that you can't necessarily see, but you can feel.
You can feel.
And that, I think, trips us up. I think we confuse our ego with ourselves. We confuse our body with our life. But there's so much more unseen beneath the surface, literally and figuratively.
Exactly.
Becoming Force is such a beautiful story, and it's so accessible. I love that book, Nest in the Stream. I love, but again, thank you for walking us through that a little bit. Again, folks, there'll be a list of these resources for us. I mean, the good news here is increasingly, at least, if we take our own, waking up as emblematic of others, this is a hard world we're living in, particularly hard, you might say, these days. And great news, through folks, through the work like yours and others, we are also finding our way not just to accessing more pain and suffering in the world, we are finding our way to accessing more ways to find resilience and to cultivate it. So, it would be it's an interesting idea, like, the suffering's going up, but as is our resilience potentially. And there's it feels like there's a race. That's probably the wrong way of putting it, but there's sort of a neck and neck kind of feel here that as we invite new levels of pain into our existence, we are also, it is encouraging, maybe even forcing us to look a little bit closer, look a little bit deeper. And the great news is, as you in your person have found, there are responses. There is something to be done. So, yeah.
And BJ, if I could just add one thing, just to to what you just said, is I think part of an unrecognized maybe kind of root cause that's in all the different stress syndromes we talked about, moral distress, compassion fatigue, and burnout, is kind of, it's both cause and an end point, but it's kind of disconnection, and disconnection from ourselves, but also disconnection from others, disconnection from our world, and kind of being trapped in this kind of bubble of isolated pain and suffering. And while really seriously valuing and acknowledging the importance of kind of basic self-care 1.0, what we're still doing there is we're doing our best to support, to prop up, to revive the stressed individual. Whereas I think what's also at the root of self-care 2.0, of deep resilience, is that it brings us back into a kind of a sense of our deeper identity, kind of remembering our deeper identity, as Thich Nhat Hanh calls us interbeings. We're not just kind of solitary skin encapsulated egos. We are interbeings. We're utterly interdependent. And that's as much where this redwood found its resilience as in its deep rootedness. It was in those lateral root systems. It was in that web that was part of something far greater. So it's kind of coming back into that sense of we-ness.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, beautifully put. And I will say, at least for, it's interesting to note the route that many of us, the way we get to see the beauty that you're describing is often by some, tragedy or trauma or something very hard forcing us to look harder. There's a wild interplay between the suffering and the resilience. I don't know that you get one without the other, which is just an interesting note. Because I think sometimes we might take the debate that you can find a life by avoiding pain and avoiding suffering, and you'll find your way, and somehow that the suffering is going to pollute you. Not so. So there's something beautiful to that, to me, and a sort of an essentialness then, therefore, to the suffering too, to pry our eyes open. So not to fetishize the suffering stuff, but it certainly does, it points us in directions. Okay, let's see here. Look at the time. Let's keep moving here a little bit, and then we can open it up to folks. Well, what to say here, Michael? Is this the moment of, shall we do a little meditation?
Well, Art, I just would love to hear some other voices coming in, BJ. I
Sure.
mean, but one thing I just want to, if I may, what I would like to do is just add to what you just said. One of my great teachers in so much that I've learned in life, and especially in the last kind of 15, 20 years, is Joanna Macy, the great uh, philosopher, ecologist, poet, activist, Buddhist scholar. But Joanna, she's got a spiral of deep resilience, which she calls the work that reconnects. And I just mentioned that because the key pivotal step in this spiral of the work that reconnects is what she calls honoring our pain. And honoring our pain is, she says, we feel the pain we feel when we look at a loved one who is sick, or when we look at our world, which is on fire. We feel the pain we feel is because we're connected, because we care. And the deeper, the more we can be with our own pain, not afraid of it, actually allowing ourselves to feel what we're feeling, that, and again, without glorifying pain in some unhealthy way, but it's just that pain is actually a symptom of our connectedness and of our caring. And that if we can find ways of being with it so that we're not overwhelmed by the intensity and the awfulness of it at times, then we can drop into our rootedness in that deeper caring and connection, which is the other side of our pain for the world, is our love for the world. And that's back to deep resilience. The deeper our roots, the wider the branches. The deeper our roots, the more, and I think that speaks to this beautiful final painting of Van Gogh's, where his trees are both trunks and roots at the same time. I mean, I think it's an exquisite painting, absolutely beautiful.
Yeah.
But the more we're rooted in what isn't afraid, in what doesn't die, the more we can be open-hearted, present, engaged.
Amen, brother. Well, that is a beautiful leaping off point, folks. So, Sones, any questions or comments out there, folks? Any hands up?
Yeah, Michael, while you were speaking, someone checked in and said, my understanding is that compassion cannot lead one to burnout, the psychological reward centers versus pain centers in the brain. So she's just hoping you can speak to that, that idea of compassion burnout versus empathy burnout.
Yeah, thank you for that. I mean, and that is something that I'm, aware of too. And I've heard Joan Halifax talking beautifully about this, and just saying, compassion um, doesn't burn out. Um, and so kind of that compassion fatigue in a way is really a misnomer, that in terms of the different stress syndromes, it would be more accurate to talk about vicarious trauma as the road to, vicarious traumatization, but also if it's chronic to burnout. That compassion arises from this deeper ground. That compassion is a quality of the heart, is a quality that what burns out is, as I was saying earlier, is even the very well intentioned and caring. If we're working with the model and the idea that it's all up to us, um, that's what kind of leads to trouble, to the kind of syndromes we've been talking about and difficulties we've been talking about. But true compassion is a quality of that deeper ground, that quality of the web, that quality, whatever words one has for that, the quality of the heart. And compassion doesn't burn out. You're right.
It makes sense, and it reminds me a little bit. It's not like you have a fixed amount of compassion, or similarly, love. Like you have to portion it out very carefully, lest you run out of this stuff. It is a fountain.
It's boundless. Yeah.
That's right. So okay, what else is going on out there, Sonia?
Yeah, someone else said, could Michael speak at some point on his work, Nest in the Stream? So, Michael, I don't know if you can just share a little bit about the book.
Oh, well, thank you. Yeah, just really, really briefly. I mean, as BJ mentioned, I mean, this is a book I wrote, and I shared the story of how I realized I was burnt out. Well, the Nest in the Stream is where I went next, after that article. Well, I went on a search, first of all, to try and understand why I was burnt out. I realized for me it was sort of chronic, low-grade vicarious trauma that, okay, I'd recognized, and I had done my best with Self-Care 101, but still it had taken a deep toll. And so for me, I turned very much to nature and to the natural world. And so the subtitle of The Nest in the Stream is Lessons from Nature on Being with Pain. And I've been lucky enough, and I am lucky enough, to have two wonderful Native American teachers, Wolf and Lisa Wapipa. And so they're really, in a way, co-authors of The Nest in the Stream with me. They literally, I mean, a lot of the book is kind of about some of the ceremonies that they allowed me to be part of, sweat lodge ceremonies, vision quests, just spending 4 days and 4 nights out lying on the earth with a question, what's going on? Why am I burnt out like this? And how do I find a way forward? And so it's the story of kind of some of what came towards me as I waited and listened. And the kind of the title of the book comes from one of those stories, which is when I encountered a bird's nest in a stream, in a pool in a stream. And it happened. I was on a weekend retreat with Wolf and Lisa, and they had sent us all out onto the land around the retreat center and just said, find a spot, sit there for a few hours, and with whatever your heart question is, and just wait and see and watch and see what comes towards you. And so that was my question at that time was, how come I'm burnt out if I've been doing all this self-care? And what came to me is, and I had realized at that stage that it was probably mostly due to how I didn't have a good way of just being with pain, my own, others. And so I wandered to the edge of the stream, looked into the pool, and there was this beautiful bird's nest. And that became my teacher. And it's a whole other kind of session to kind of talk about that. But the words that came with that in that moment were the loose and open weave of the heart. And and so what I was being shown was another way of being present to pain, where my heart didn't need to be a rock in the stream that was kind of utterly protected, but impenetrable. I could actually be loose and open. My heart could be loose and open to my own pain, to the pain of others, but only if I'm in the stream, only if, like the redwood, I'm rooted in that something deeper, that deeper flow. And so, so that became my teacher. So it's kind of a story of different little lessons I learned along the way.
Beautiful. Highly recommended, folks. I'm wondering, well, sounds where there are more questions. I was about to go.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
I'm just reminded as we're talking, the language you're using and the things you're pointing us to remind me a little bit of the work happening around psychedelics these days. And there's not necessarily much to say there. I'm just kind of looking, I'm just feeling the points of connection from what otherwise might feel like disparate work. But I think from my own experience and people I've talked to, I think a lot of psychedelics, it's not about the substance itself, but as a way to feel, to sense or feel that root system beneath us, or that sense of, or that connection that we may not be able to see, or the thing that we might otherwise be cut off from. Yeah. Have you in your work, Michael, have you run across a lot of psychedelic assisted therapy, or is that something coming up for you as bumping into your work too?
Yeah, no, it's definitely coming up, and it's not something that an area I've worked in, but I work side by side and closely with people who really combine kind of meditation practice, nature connection practice in kind of sort of simple, organic ways, and with psychedelic assisted therapy. And I think it can be incredibly valuable. And I've heard the stories of many people in, situations of kind of living with serious illness, and coming into that experience of what isn't afraid, what is deeply connected, and how transformative that can be. One of my meditation teachers, really just acknowledges the value of psychedelic assisted therapy and where it can bring one to. And he says it's like, the way he sees it, it's like a window through which you can kind of look into this world and glimpse this world and see this world and briefly experience this world. But he said, for him, it's not a doorway into it. It's a window into it that allows that glimpse, that experience. And of course, that glimpse, that experience can be transformative. So it's not that you need to kind of go back there every day. Whereas, having a practice where you have a simple way of kind of opening to just the vitality and the aliveness of the natural world, or simple ways of coming into basic open awareness, which is kind of, always right here, but unrecognized.
Right.
One of the great Tibetan teachers said, it's so close we can't see it, so simple we can't believe it's true, so deep we can't fathom it, and so noble we don't feel worthy of it, but it's always right here. So.
Ooh, boy. I'd like to write that on my wall somewhere. That sounded just right on to me. I mean, the language we might try to struggle to find to describe these places runs the risk of sounding esoteric or an article of faith or something inaccessible. But let's not be confused by our clunky vocabularies. There is this, in some ways, we might feel disconnected from these planes. I think the truth is we are connected. Something might be gumming it up, or that note around self-worth is a big one. I hear myself talk myself out of these truths because I don't know, because this or that, I'm not worthy, or I can't see it, therefore I got to stick with what I can see, or I find all sorts of ways to talk myself out of these simple truths. So I just want to make that point here that, or echo what you just said as being so, so key. This is not an exotic land we're talking about. This is this land. This is us.
It's kind of about remembering, really. It's about
Mm-hmm.
deeply remembering who we already are. It's not,
Mm-hmm.
yeah. And it's about experiencing, not believing. It's not,
Right.
and it's incredibly inclusive. It's
Mm-hmm.
not about a spiritual bypass,
Right.
it's
Is anything excluded from this zone? Is there any, is it, I'm not sure anything. No, I don't.
I don't think so.
I
No.
don't think so either. And you might say that's where so much of the trouble comes in our penchant for exclusion.
Mm.
Or just, I always, it's fun to think about how we are interesting, not maybe fun, like a distinguished person is someone distinguished from others, like separate from others. We heroize these states, an exclusive club, or whatever it is. It's so much the problem,
Mm.
in so
Mm.
many ways. Yeah.
Mhm. It's something
Cool.
incredibly, incredibly simple
Yep.
at the root of it all.
Right on.
Let's call back to the trees, Michael, the root of it. Sorry, just have to call that out.
Yeah. Thank you.
Uh,
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
well, folks, I know we're about at the hour. Is there more? I mean, boys, of course there's more, but any last thoughts from the audience out there or anything? Anyone, any questions or
It looks like none, and I don't think that's necessarily,
Deb?
Deb.
Hi, Deb. Hi, Deb.
Deb, you know the drill.
Yeah, I know the drill. I just want to leap at this amazing opportunity to thank you for your work, Michael. And I work with BJ, so he knows my indigenousality here with my own path. And I am a patient here. But one of the things that I wanted to bring in is, a lot of what you presented is so much of how we have to deal with the modern world. Like we compartmentalize, like I'm going to do a practice here, and then I'm going to exercise over here, and then I'm going to do this self-care bath over here, and then it can almost become like a checklist of like, this is what I have to do to take care of myself, as compared with this integrated way of being. And I too have a indigenous friend who I'm very close with, and one of the things that he's taught me so much. But I'm a farmer and an herbalist, so I am with and out all the time and interacting with the plants and the streams, and I live in the mountains far from people. So it's very much who I am, and it's integrated into my lifestyle. And I start my day with like, what does the land need of me today? What's, walk the land and see
Mm.
what's needed. So I guess I just wanted to kind of add that as something that like a place of going even deeper with these roots, and this place of, like, TIXN talks about that in their indigenous languages, everything is a verb. So there's no noun connecting noun, person to this, or me connecting to a tree. It's like we're all movements, all moving and interacting together. And for me personally, once I really started to grasp that, and it was a concept, but as I grasped that, it really changed me. It was like I was no longer connecting with something. I was in deep relationship at all times. And I guess I think that's available for everybody, even if they aren't a farmer or an herbalist or somebody who has access to the redwood forest. I mean, I think that
Yeah, no, totally.
once everything becomes alive and you realize we're all verbs like that, this whole thing just kind of cracks open. And even if we're in cities, we're relating in that way, which I think is what you're talking about, that deeper ground, that deeper awareness. So
that's beautiful. That's so beautiful, Deb. Thank you. Absolutely. No, you're talking about I've been talking about how we can tap into that, remember that. You're talking about how in time, and it's a realization, but then it's a being and a becoming. We become that. We realize that's who we really are. It's it becomes our new basis of operation. It becomes our way of life.
yeah.
Thank you so much.
Well, thank you for the ground that you laid for me to share that, but also for your work and how you're planting those seeds all over, and BJ is too. So
Thank you so
I
much.
thank you both.
Thank you, Deb. And Deb, I'm so glad you're here today. I was thinking of you throughout, because I know you to demonstrate, you live these words. And you guys are both, as you were talking, you're reminding me of this realization that just I'm really, it's been so helpful. One of the weird false dichotomies that it's opened up is humans versus nature. So as though to go out to nature, and again, it's this thing over there. But the second you can, if you see humans as also parts of nature, then the forest can be in you. Going out in the forest can be going into yourself, quite the same. And so wherever you are, this resilience is potentially accessible. So anyway.
Beautifully put. Thank you.
Oh, all right, Sonia. Well, any other last comment?
A statement of gratitude. I was already burnt out, then became the caregiver for my dying sister. She passed last week and I am bereft. The word shared by Michael is like a balm. The word pictures an arrow into the days of healing ahead. Thank you so much for your gentle kindness.
Oh, thank you, Sonia. I'm so sorry.
Yeah, thanks, Deb, for sharing that. That's beautiful. I'm sorry to hear about your sister.
Well, Michael.
BJ, thank you so much. And thank you, BJ, for everything, and for including me in this. And thank you, Sonia, so much for all your help in pulling this together, putting up with my fussiness over the slides.
It's my pleasure. Thank you so much for being here with us, and thank you everyone for joining us.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Happy weekend, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.